TinyTableGames. Today I'll be playing Twilight Struggle, Conflict in the Red Sea. Twice, in fact, first as the Soviet player, second as the US player. This is a game that you can either play head-to-head or as solo, with the rule system acting as the AI for the other player. There's a lot of interesting factors in this game. It's mostly card-driven. You play over 2 rounds. Whoever has the most victory points at the end of the second round is declared the winner. But there are a few immediate win conditions. Ironically, one of them is nuclear war. I'm not sure who considers that a win, but for game purposes, it is. So with that said, let's go take a look.
Okay, here is the board for Twilight Struggle, Red Sea Conflict in the Horn of Africa. The side panels here are just player reference. The actual playing section is inside the dark square here and is focused solely where everything happens. There's a couple of tracks, most notably the victory point track, where you don't track your individual victory points, you track the difference between victory points and who's farther ahead. So this will either be on the Soviet side or the US side, depending on who's farther ahead. It's kind of a weird way of doing it, but it's to give you a feeling of the back and forth struggle during the Cold War, I suppose. Mostly it just makes it slightly more confusing to track victory points, but there you go. All right, there's required military operations. You have to do a certain number of these each turn, indicating your side's political and military influence in the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East. And if you don't do that, you give victory points to your opponent. How many military operations are required? It depends on, ironically, the DEFCON status. You start the game at DEFCON 4, which means each person has to accomplish 4 military actions during their 7-card turn. And you automatically lose, by the way, if you're the person who pushes DEFCON to 1 on your turn and causes nuclear war. I would say everybody loses, but for game purposes, whoever causes the war is the one who loses it. There are 7 actions possible per turn, and there are 2 rounds, so that way you can, again, just for counter use, I guess, they always flip it back and forth for tracking whose turn it is during which action. That can be handy because a lot of stuff can happen because it's card-driven, and card-driven games always cause issues that way. Okay, each of these little squares represents a country. The little lines between them indicates adjacency, effectively, in one way or another, either logistical or geographical. Each number in the little country indicates how many points of influence you need to have control. So, for example, in Ethiopia, ignore the extra 3 there. The U.S. has 1 influence, which is sufficient to cause control, which is why it's on the pretty blue side and not the white side. That indicates influence. This indicates you actually have control. Same over here in South Yemen. The Soviets currently have control because they only need 1 and they have 1. If you're in an area like in Somalia down here, the Soviets at the start of the game only have 1 point of influence, and as you can see, where you put your starting influence is actually hardwired onto the board itself. That matters since in scoring, presence is you have control at least 1 country, domination is you control most of, and 1 of the battleground countries. Battleground countries are purple, so there's only in the Horn of Africa 2, Kenya and Egypt, because Egypt counts for both the Middle East and for the Horn of Africa. In the Middle East, the only battleground country, ironically, is Saudi Arabia. So that means that Egypt is going to be fairly contested either way. Note that to get to Egypt, as you spread your influence, you spread it adjacent. So the only way to get to Egypt is through the Sudan and either Ethiopia or Somalia, which is why, of course, they're linked that way, and those are the immediate win conditions in the game. So it's a bit rougher for the Soviets to get into Egypt and start influencing it, except there are some cards that let you drop influence directly into that location. Now, while that's going on, there's a few other things. There's the space race, which will on itself not win you the game, but it does give you some advantages as you advance your token up the space race. It gives you some, lets you remove influence from other people, gives you some victory points, lets you draw a card. You can only get up to that point. There's only 3 spaces, 3 advancements you can make. But it's effectively, in the rules, it says really that's a way of just dumping cards you don't want to have to play. And obviously you can only do that 3 times. So there you go, that's the basic setup. There is a solo rulebook, a regular rulebook, a player card that's two-sided. That side tells you about what the phases of the round are. That side gets into the detail of card play. This side gives you a detail about what cards you can play when. That's the Soviet side. This is the US side. There's the cards. There's late war cards, which is why they're turned sideways. They just have the same backing. The mid-war cards, because there's only 2 rounds in this game, mid-war and late war. As you can see up here on the turn track, you start in mid-war, late war, and then the end, when you actually do the final scoring to see who, quote-unquote, won. And then finally is the solo player action round. There's 2 sides, the US side and the Soviet side. I'll be using the US side first because I'll be playing as the Soviets, and this represents the AI brain that'll be rolling for the US player during the turns. One other thing I should point out, I mentioned required military operation track. There is only 2 things that can cause military operations. One is if you attempt a coup in a country, which you'll see me doing throughout the game. And the second method is there's a single card in the deck of all those cards that is a particular war card that counts as a military operation. So effectively, each turn, you're going to have at least 1 or 2 coups, or you're going to start giving your opponent victory points, which I suppose is a way of ensuring that the players play to the instability of the region given the historical background, which is kind of a clever mechanism, really. The only problem with performing a coup is that can cause issues in some cases, especially in Somalia and Ethiopia. If you cause a coup in either of those locations, notice the little lightning bolt, that very likely, with the flip of a card to determine whether it's happened or didn't, will cause the DEFCON status to drop. So and there's also some card play that will cause DEFCON status to drop automatically. So you can very quickly lose this game if you're not paying attention. Okay, here's the board set up at the start of the game with everything in its place. I've dealt out the 9 cards to myself as the Russian player at the start of round 1. These are what I'm looking at. The Lion Falters, Eritrean Popular Liberation Front, French Connections, US Aid, Nazarism, Arab League, Famine, F5Es delivered, and the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. The first thing that happens is each side gets to play their highlight card for the event on it. So I don't want to play anything that's going to favor the US in this case. So I believe I'm going with the Lion Falters. Ethiopia is not controlled by USSR, so I'll get 1 influence and clear all US influence from Ethiopia. Initially, that'll at least give me influence there and give me control of Ethiopia right off the bat, which is, if you check out the auto conditions there, Ethiopia and Somalia, and controls more African countries. So, considering that's like the game's over regardless of what phase the game is in, seems like that's a good thing to go for. So, the Soviets played their event, and for the solo player, the AI bot, if you will, just top decks to see what event they get. Add 1 influence in 1 non-battleground country equal to your opponent's influence. All right. So effectively, he will lose influence in Ethiopia thanks to mine. And digging out the right token over here. And he picks up 1 influence in a non-battleground country equal to your opponent's influence. So that means that South Yemen is now contested. And that concludes the initial event phase. Those get discarded. Well, this one, because it's got an underline under it and an asterisk, gets removed from the game. So I'll put that way up there. And this one just goes to the discard pile. There's one other card of note for the US player. They start with Romanian autonomy. In the solo player rules, it says basically this never gets played. It just sits on the US Autobot side. and they get 1 VP at the end of the game for holding the card, unless you can do something to change who holds it. All right, we're out of that phase, out of the headline phase that is. Now we're into action rounds. So start at action round 1 here. The Soviets need to play a card. And what are we looking at? Well, I got Ethiopia. I want Somalia back. So the start may be to do some influence ops and pick up some influence in Somalia and Yemen, I think. Now to put out influence, you have to already be adjacent to a place that you have influence in, or be in the place where the influence is at. It costs 1 operation point to play influence, unless they have more influence than you in the same location, in which case it costs you 2. So, I don't want to spin that. Now the Ocean of Peace here, score 2 victory points. All countries are treated as battleground countries. I don't want to give the opponent 2 victory points because I play that. Because whatever you play for operation points, your opponent gets the effect of. This might be the way to go. Remove all Russian influence from Djibouti and Madagascar, of which there is none now, and add 2 U.S. influence in one of those countries. So it may be worth my time to do this, even though that'll give the U.S. player more of a foothold. Fortunately, I have a lot of cards that affect the U.S. more than they affect me. All right, I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to use the mid-war 2 points, which just gets discarded rather than removed from the game. All Russian influencers removed from Djibouti or Madagascar. There isn't in any in either, and add 2 U.S. influence in one of those countries. And in such case, the game tells you to just pick one. And so in this case, I think Madagascar is where they're going to go, and that will give the U.S. control there. Pretty sure there's a 2 somewhere. There it is. In Madagascar. All right. Now we're over to the first play of the solo player action thing, which requires using this board over here. Use the operation value of this card to resolve the following chart by checking the columns below from left to right. Okay, so this is the card. Mid-war Apollo-Soyuz project. Play the leftmost card in the event line, which is basically just cards left to right for the Autobot player, if you will. Okay, zoomed out a little bit so you can see the track. So the Soyuz project, now let's see. Play the leftmost card in the event line. That skips this row if operations are granted by event. So after pondering this chart for a minute, the U.S. does not control any flashpoint country or 3 countries in Africa. Therefore, they need to coup, according to this chart, if I'm reading that right, which would make sense anyway. So they're going to use the 2 ops points from the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And they are going to coup in Ethiopia. Because, hey, why not? Now that may cause the DEFCON status to change, but we'll get to that. So to resolve this coup attempt, I roll the US die, add the value of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, which was a 2. Roll that again so you can see it. That's a 1. That makes it a 3. However, if the modified die roll is greater than stability number of the targeted country times 2, Ethiopia's stability number is a 1. So double that as a 2, so it does exceed that. The coup is successful. Remove opposing influence marker equal to the difference between the modified die roll and the stability number. So a 3 minus 2 is 1. So it's sufficient to remove that 1 token. If there are insufficient opposing influence markers, add your own influence marker. So the U.S. doesn't get a foothold in Ethiopia because of its crappy roll, but it was sufficient to remove Russia from Ethiopia. And that's their first turn. Also, that moves the U.S. up 2 on the required military operations because it goes up equal to the number of operation points you spent on the coup. Oh, and finally, because it was a scoring card, a scoring nation, or excuse me, a flashpoint nation, being Ethiopia, you got to flip this, and if it was a 1 or a 2, that would cause the DEFCON to sink lower. But it wasn't, so we carry on. Okay, it's now the Soviets' second turn of the, or second action round of the first turn. You don't get any new cards till later. Obviously, the influence is a serious issue. We need to do something about that immediately. We'd use the Arab League, but I want points. The victory points that come with that. Can try and coup in Madagascar. That might be the thing to do. Okay, so going to use this famine card because it affects everybody. The event wording does not kick off, and it's simply 2 operations points. In this case, use the 2 operation points to spread influence, I think, is probably going to be the most effective thing to do. Spreading influence costs 1 operational point, and I have 2 to work with. So first, I'm going to spend it in South Yemen in order to take control. Whoops, excuse me, that's the U.S., not the Russians. There we go. So, because South Yemen is only a 1-point stability plus 1 point of U.S. influence, having 2 still gives me sufficient control of the place. Okay, that's 1 operational point. For the second operational point, going to increase the foothold in Somalia so that the Soviets are controlling both South Yemen and Somalia. And that is the end of their action round. So then we come to the bottom of the second, and we find out what the machine wants to do for the U.S. turn. Let's see. The U.S. adds 1 influence more in Sudan than the Russia has in Ethiopia. Well, obviously that's not a good use, so probably just use the 1 operational point. And referring back to the chart, let's see. The U.S. does not control a flashpoint country, which is either Ethiopia or Somalia. Realign if there's a Russia-controlled flashpoint country with at least +2 net realignment modifier. There definitely is not that. The Russia does not have a choke point influence. It is not DEFCON 3. Add U.S. military operations. A coup is possible in any country. Okay. So basically just coup somewhere to get yourself up on the military point scale. Or at what point do you spread influence with this chart, or does that just never happen? So yeah, I guess place influence is the correct way, because I think you go across and down through each column. So place influence is the correct answer according to this chart this time. So it's got 1 point of influence to place, so the U.S. will play it someplace where they can have control of something. They have influence in Yemen. They really need to get influence going. They can't afford it there, but they can put 1 point of influence because of their place in Madagascar up here in Kenya, which is good because that's a battleground location, which is key for scoring should that come up. They don't control it yet, but at least there's influence there. And that's a pretty tolerably good. If I'm doing something hideously wrong, feel free to comment. Let's see, back to the Soviet action. Top of the third. Still no card refresh, it never happens. You just got what you got. Let's see. Egypt, Sudan, South Yemen. Got Yemen. Don't have Saudi Arabia. And as much as this 3-point F5Es thing is really cool, I think I'm going to burn the 3 operational points for it. And I hear people groaning in the distance, but that's okay. Okay, so with 3 operational points to spread more influence. And yes, I know I need to get cooing, as they say, but okay. From Somalia, can spread influence into the Sudan. It only requires 1 to take control. That's 1 point. From Sudan to Ethiopia, 1 point to control there. And from the Sudan up to Egypt is 1 point. So that's a total of 3, which I can't control Egypt, but I can influence it. And that changes the situation for the Soviets rather significantly. Bottom of turn 3. Let's see. If the U.S. does not control a flashpoint country, which it does not, or at least 3 countries in Africa, and Africa scoring is not in the discard pile, remove Soviet control of flashpoint country, or changes control of sufficient countries to prevent automatic victory. Because right now, automatic victory is control Ethiopia and Somalia, check, and control more African countries. Let's see, so I got 1, 2, 3 is the Soviets, and the U.S. only has 1 currently, so if Africa scoring comes up, the Soviets would win right now. So that first column applies. So the first card that comes up, discard 1 Soviet associated card from the U.S. hand, retrieve, okay, that doesn't do anything, but it does give 3 operation points. So with those 3 operation points, it's time to coup. All right, so probably Somalia. Well, Ethiopia is easier, and it kind of chokes off the Russians a little bit. So Ethiopia it is. Cooing in Ethiopia again. So the opponent must have influence in the target country, check. Region restricted by DEFCON level, not yet. Coups in battleground countries, lower DEFCON level. It is not a battleground country, it's a flashpoint. So we determine if this is going to trigger a DEFCON change, and it does. Now let's see, does that mean you can't finish the coup out? Let me check that ruling. Okay, so other than bringing the world closer to nuclear war, we're going with the coup attempt. So it's the die roll plus the 3 points, operational points, which will boost the military operations up to a 5 for the U.S., so yay for them. So that gives a total of 5, and it has to be less than double, or excuse me, more than double. So the influence there is 2, and their basic stability is a 1. So let's see how that works. Okay, since the influence, according to the side chart, of the Soviets is greater, than the base stability, although it's actually about the same. So it's a total of 5. It's a 1 there. So 5 minus 1 will double that, makes it a 2, so 3 points. A difference, so 1 point spent getting away their influence, and 2 points of U.S. influence show up, which gives them control of Ethiopia in one fell swoop. Pretty sure I did that right, I'll check the rules. Okay, that seems to have been correct. Now we move on to the top of turn 4. Discard that. Back to the Soviets, trying to do something useful. Control. Okay, so now's the time to use this one. For 1 operational point, the Eritrean Popular Liberation Front, if Ethiopia is Soviet controlled, gain 1 VP and add 1 influence to the US. Happily, that is not the case, so the only thing that happens is I'm using 1 operational point. And what am I going to do with that operational point? I need to do some cooing because we're running out of time in this round and I don't want to hand victory points over. So I think the coup is going to happen. Or should I just spread influence? Ooh, influence might be better. Except there's another coup attempt. Well, if I coup now, the U.S. cannot coup again without causing war, thermonuclear war, probably. So maybe that's the way to go. Coup in Kenya, which will be more challenging, and yes, because it's a battleground state, it will automatically cause the DEFCON status to go up. There's a +1 from the card, plus, oh boy, 2. Well, minus double the control value, so the coup fails. That's really disappointing. And the DEFCON status climbs to 1 step away from thermonuclear war. And now it is the U.S.'s bottom of turn 4. Their card is, I believe, one they're just going to ignore. Let me check the chart. There's a couple special rules on that. Let's see. If it's Russia associated, place on top of discard pile. Use the operation value of this card to resolve the following chart. Okay, so you just ignore it, and they just get 3 operational points. So 3 operational points in this case. They need to spread influence. So put 1 in Kenya. Man, I really needed that coup to work. Let's see. Can put 1 in. Can put 2 in Saudi Arabia. So we can control Saudi Arabia, such as it is. And then go for Egypt. So gonna spread influence up into the Sudan, which means that the Soviets lose control and nobody's got control, everybody just has influence. And that's the end of the U.S. turn 4, start of turn 5 for the Soviets. I feel like I'm losing. Oh, I only went up 1 point for that lousy coup attempt. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. I can play it for the event, but all countries are treated as bound. That may be the way to go. Except I still need to is there anything I can use the mid-war one? There's still a little bit of time. All right, we're going to use Nasserism as an event, which means that future coup attempts, I'll get a +1 to their die roll for the remainder of this turn. So I'm going to leave that sitting right here as a reminder that that's the case. And that's the exciting conclusion of the Soviet turn. Bottom of turn 5. Let's see what the U.S. is doing. U.S. presidential elections. So you just ignore that, and the U.S. uses the 1 point. That could have been real handy for me, but all right. Okay. Once again, it looks like the U.S. just needs to spread influence, which is kind of getting annoying. In this case, they only have 1 point to do it with. So they will spread influence into Djibouti, I guess. That'll allow them to start doing realignments here in a second, because they have so much positive influence, because there's a chart for doing realignments when you have a +2, which they'll now have in a lot of places. It's looking grim for the Soviets. Top of turn 6. Okay, well, the Soviets are going to have to use the mid-war effect here, which is going to give the U.S. 1 operational point, which they will take advantage of first, which will give them 1 more point of influence, which will give them full control of Djibouti. In exchange for 2 operational points for the Russians, who must attempt a coup in Ethiopia, because things are looking bad. Oh, if we do that, though, it could be nuclear war, and they could lose anyway. If they try it in Egypt, well, they don't need to. They just increase influence in Egypt, but they got to shake something off because there's too much influence there. So it looks like we got to go for That's interesting. Maybe not coup. Maybe use those 2 points for influence instead. Can spend 1 influence to take over Egypt. And I think it's 1 influence here because nobody has control of it yet. Otherwise, it'd be 2 influence. So that will give the Soviets control of the Sudan again, which is probably a much better choice because now 1, 2, 3 controlled in Africa and unfortunately 4 for the US. So the Soviets are still down, but should Africa's scoring come up, they won't get the auto win. All right, bottom of turn 6 for the US. Détente, which means discard it and just use the action or the operational point for the US, which in this case, is there a column in here for kicking Russian's tail? Does not control a flashpoint country, or at least 3 countries. Nope, got that. Choke point influence. Nope. DEFCON 3. Nope. U.S. military operations list. Nope. No other conditions apply. Play first playable card in event line or influence. Okay, so influence it is. So I guess they will put 1 point of influence into Yemen, which won't give them control of anything, but they're the only ones in the Middle East at this point, which is somewhat ironic. Okay, so at the top of turn 7 for the Soviets, we're halfway through the game just about. The question comes up, what to do? Nasserism was a mistake because we're so close to nuclear war that if Russia tries it, there's a good chance it'll just kick off the end of the game and Russia will lose immediately. Or excuse me, the Soviet Union will lose immediately, not Russia. So the only real questions are, do I play the Arab League because I now control Egypt, Sudan, and South Yemen, which is the requirement, and pick up 3 victory points? Or do I use those points to move 1 up the space race, which removes 1 influence from 1 country after the headline phase? That's the... And then the step after that is getting 2 victory points or 1 victory point. Nah. Arab League it is. Playing it for the event. The Soviets score 3 victory points. That brings us to the bottom of the 7th. Feel free to stretch and sing about peanuts and whatnot if you need to. And let's see what the US is doing. Oh man, sure would have liked to have had that. All right, so 2 operational points for the US. Why are all the good Soviet cards going to the US? Anyway, okay, so what do they need to do? They can't coup because that'll potentially end the game. So I think we're still in the same spot we were at before, which is spread influence. Unless there's a realignment if a Soviet-controlled flashpoint country with at least +2 net realignment. Okay, well, 1, 2, yep, there's a +2 realignment. So we will attempt to do a realignment in Somalia. Okay, so doing a realignment is just a weird way of saying reducing influence in a country. Opponent must have influence, check. Region restricted by DEFCON level, that's a good point, but that applies to the Middle East, not to Africa. Does not affect the DEFCON level. For each ops, player rolls 1 die, modified by the target country. So, attempting to realign here, +1, +1, +1, I do believe. And so it's a +3 for the US and a +1 for the Soviets, I believe. +1 for player with more influence in target, yes. Higher roll removes difference in opponent's influence. All right, so that's a 4 for the US and a 7 for the Soviets. До свидания, родной Советский Союз. Anyway, that means the higher roller removes the difference in opponent's influence. That's interesting. Does that mean that the Soviets could remove influence? But that doesn't make any sense because there's nobody there. Let me check the rules. So no, it doesn't add anything and nobody else gets removed because the U.S. doesn't have anybody in Somalia anyway. But they have 2 operational points that only costed 1, so they're going to try it again and try to do better than a 1 this time. Same location, Somalia. Ouch, that makes it a 7. So that's going to work against the Soviet 7. So once again, tie, nothing happens. Once again, they're singing in the 1960s equivalent of, or 70s equivalent of the Red October, their Russian hymns. That brings us to the end of turn 1, and the start of turn 2, wherein we shuffle in the late war cards, and I check out what else we need to do. Stand by. Okay, so sure enough, the first thing we do is go back 1 level on the DEFCON status. We add in the late war cards to the draw deck of the mid-war cards, excuse me. And so I will shuffle those in. These have already been shuffled, so I guess I'll just mix them all together. Once that's done, we'll deal out 9 cards to the Russian player again. Since the Autobot doesn't get cards, they just top deck it each time, so there's no point in doing that. And then it'll be the headline phase again. Oh, also, the Autobot character at the start of the turn goes up 1 level in space, which means right after the headlines, they get to remove 1 Soviet influence of their choice, basically, because they launched a satellite, I guess. Remove 1 influence from 1 country. Yep, and just straight up, just yank the influence. That's an interesting choice. All right. So there's my 1 holdout card from last game, or last round. So 8 new cards, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's see what we got. Late War, Mr. Niet. That's funny. Degrade the DEFCON level by 1, remove all U.S. influence in 2 countries. Wow. That is an awesome card. Daniel Arap Moy. If the U.S. controls Kenya, 1 victory point and improve or degrade DEFCON to 1 space. Otherwise, add 2 U.S. influence in Kenya. Another U.S. 1. Ooh, Africa scoring. Well, gonna have to play that. Cannot be held. Oh, man. Presidential Directive 30. The Russia may add 1 influence anywhere and may take an 8th action round this turn. Wow. Okay. CENTCOM. Nope, don't want to use that. And Diego Garcia. Well, it's not all terrible news anyway, but man, it sure is a lot more U.S. influence than Soviet influence in this one. Plus the scoring. Bring the action round count back to here. Let's see, the U.S. is going to take advantage of this and pull 1 Soviet influence out of Somalia, reducing it to influence rather than control. And it's the start of the Soviet turn. Headline phase. So let's see, what headline is the way to go? It seems like, don't want to do that. Obviously not that. Nope. You may add 1 influence anywhere and may take an 8th action round this turn. That might be the way to go. The Soviets are going to play Presidential Directive 30. Add 1 influence anywhere. Well, they're going to put it right back in Somalia. Thank you very much. As soon as I find that 2 token again. And now they get a go last, which is a nice surprise. Required military operations. Forgot to do that. That would give the U.S. 1 victory point last turn because the Soviets only ever had 1 military operation and they had to have at least 2 because the DEFCON status was on 2. So that gave the U.S. 1 victory point but the Soviets were at 3, so that leaves the Soviets in the lead, but now with 2 victory points. And required military operations has reset. Okay, so with this reminder floating around, we'll stick it over here. What is the US Autobot doing? They are playing Middle East scoring. Can you actually do that? Not for that, I don't think. Let me check the solo rules on what happens when that pops up. Oh no, I take it back. Scoring cards may be played in the headline phase, however they're considered to have an operation value of 0 and occur second. Okay, so he does play the scoring card in the Middle East. Okay, so for the scoring I had to look this up. Presence means that a superpower has control of at least one country in that region, which is in fact both. Oh, although Egypt counts as the Middle East and Africa, so interesting. All right. So the U.S. scores 3 for that, and the Soviets score 6, so that gives a +3 overall to the Russians. I get it now. Boy, that's slightly poorly worded. So you get 3 points for presence for 1 or more. So that wouldn't have been scored like that. This would have stayed down here at 3. So the US would get 3, and the Soviets would get 3, which means that there's no change to the score track overall. So it stays on 2. So for Middle East scoring, 5 points of domination, +1 per controlled battleground in a country in a region. And control, a superpower has control if it controls more countries than its opponent and controls all of the battleground countries. It does not do that, so you get domination instead, which is 5 points, +1 per controlled battleground country in the region, so that's a total of 6 points from 2, which brings them up to 8. Okay, round 2, attempting to score this again, so both sides score presence. So putting this back down where it was. So the U.S. does have presence in Saudi Arabia, so they get 3 points. The Soviets have presence in 2 locations, which should give them still 3 points, because it's at least 1. The Soviets scored, which balances out, so the score victory point track doesn't actually change. The Soviets have domination, but not control, so that does give them 5, +1 for controlled battleground country in the region, which the US has 1 and Egypt has 1, so those cancel each other out. So it's just a +5, so that takes it to +7 for the scoring. And nobody's in the sea lanes, which is probably a mistake because you get double victory points for that. All right, so that means the Soviets are at 7 victory points, which is pretty close to a win, thanks to this ridiculously early scoring card. Thank you, US. Whew, now that we got that sorted out, and remembering that the Soviets get an extra turn 8 thanks to a presidential directive, it is now time for the action rounds, starting with the Soviet player, which is me. So let's see what we got. All right, if I manage to coup Ethiopia. All right. So, causing a coup with Mr. Nyet in Ethiopia for 4 points. So 4 plus 3, so 7. And it's double what's in there, so that makes it a 5, because that's the base control thing, or influence. How does that work again? That's weird. Double check. Okay, so I played a 4, rolled a 3. Couple things I need to do because Ethiopia is a flashpoint country is flip this, and if it's 1 or a 2, nope, it does not degrade, so that just goes back onto the bottom of the deck again. So DEFCON status doesn't change. Let's see, it was a total of 7. 7 minus twice that is 1 is 2, so there's 5 points total. So that means remove the 2 US points. Man, that's pretty big, actually. And put in 3 of Soviet control to make up the other 5. that suddenly is looking real good for the Russians. Excuse me, the Soviets. All right, that brings us to the bottom of turn 1. And the decision tree, I believe. Let's see. Remove Russian control of flashpoint country or change control of sufficient countries to prevent automatic victory. Yep, so that's what they got to work on. Cento collapses. Remove total of 2 U.S. influence from the Middle East. Nope, that's not going to be. So they're going to use that one. And they're going to, the U.S. is going to attempt a coup in Somalia. They got 1 operational point plus this. That's a 5, which is bigger than double the difference. That's a 4. So that reduces control, reduces 1 point of influence, which prevents the Soviets from controlling Somalia and getting the instant victory, which is at least something. And that takes us to the top of round 2. So because that was a coup attempt, the Soviets went up to 4 and the US went up 1 because of the operational points used. Might be a time to use that. What's the thing to do here? I think we're going to use this mid-war. Diego Garcia, add 2 U.S. influence and remove 1 Russian influence from strategic sea lanes. So that gives the U.S. 2 points of influence in the strategic sea lanes, but not control, so that's something. And those 2 operational points are going to get used for realignment rolls. First, we're going to attempt to realign the Sudan, I think. Well, does that matter that much? It kind of bothers me, though. I don't like having him stuck there being able to challenge in Egypt right off the bat. Probably better off to challenge in either. Yep, in Kenya is the place to go. Okay, so going to attempt to realign in Kenya. In Kenya, Russia has a +1 coming from here. The U.S. has a +1 coming from here. I think that should apply too, shouldn't it? We'll check. Well, maybe that's not the best choice then. Maybe I ought to use the 2 points on just doing a coup in Kenya instead. That will, yes, a coup in Kenya is definitely the way to go. It is a battleground, which means it'll automatically improve or degrade DEFCON, depending on your perspective on life. So that brings it down to a 2. And it was a 2-point operational effect, which moves their Russian military operations up to a 5. And a 2 plus 1 is a 3, which is not double. So the coup attempt fails. Well, at least I brought us closer to nuclear war. That's something. All right, bottom of turn 2 for the U.S. They are not in danger of having immediate scoring loss. They are definitely not doing that. So they're using the 2 operational points to what? Okay, so it looks like we're going to go with a realignment operation in Ethiopia. So, U.S. gets a +1, the Soviets get a +1, whoever rolls higher, and the Soviets get a second +1 for having more influence. So it's +2 versus a +1. So that's I believe a 6 right there. Yep. So that's 7 for the U.S. and 5 for the Soviets. So that degrades their influence by 2. Ouch. Yeah. Okay, top of round 3 for the Soviets. Looks like influence spreading is the thing to do. Boy, what terrible cards. Okay, let's see. We use the late war Daniel Arap Moi. If the U.S. controls Kenya, they gain 1 victory point, so the Russian victory total goes down to 6. And improve or degrade DEFCON 1 space, which the U.S. will obviously move in that direction so they don't lose the game. That gets removed from the game also, because it's an asterisk 1. And those 2 points are going to go to influence. Influence. Because we need to add 1 point of influence in Ethiopia again to regain control. Well, I mean, technically it was control at 1, but just didn't feel as safe. And 1 more point of influence in Somalia, putting the Soviets back in position to win the game if they can ever get the chance to play that card. And back to the U.S. at the bottom of turn 3. They get 3 points, and ignore this. So they can afford to coup in 1 location, and with the 3-pointer they're going to, they'll do it in Ethiopia because it's easier. Let's see, does that trigger DEFCON? It does. DEFCON goes down again. 3 plus a 2. So that makes it a 5, which is more than double. So that's good for them. Less great for the Russians, or the Soviets, excuse me. So that gives them just enough to remove both tokens from the U.S., or excuse me, from the Soviets, and put 1 point of influence to give them control of Ethiopia. That was a heck of a good play for the U.S. Turn 4, running out of time. All these terrible, terrible choices. Definitely going to play this, but just not yet. Would love to get the automatic victory, but let's see. Presence. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So right now the U.S. would take domination. That's not great. So, but they wouldn't have control. The U.S. needs, or the Soviets need to do something. Can't take Kenya because that'll cause thermonuclear war. Can't really risk that. What to do? Gonna have to do a realignment in Kenya, I think. What to do it with? All right, I guess we'll have to burn the Albano-Stalinist economics, which stinks for me, but that'll be in play too, so every time I do influence ops, I'll get 1 less operation point than the card suggests, because yay. All right, and do a realignment roll. First one in Kenya. It's +2 for the U.S. and +1 for the Soviets, which I probably should have thought. +3 for the U.S., great. So that gives them a 6, so all hope is not lost for the Soviets. And they actually pull it off and reduce it by 1. And the Soviets will now attempt the same thing in Ethiopia. This time it's a +1, +1, so +2 for the US. Ouch, that's unbeatable. And +1 for the Soviets. So, well, that was kind of disappointing, to be honest. Bottom of 4, back to the US. Oh, good. The events of '86. Score 1 VP if South Yemen is in Russia controlled, then remove Russian influence in the Middle East, equal to the number of US controlled countries in the region. Wow. That's not that helpful. It's 1 victory point. Well, maybe. All right. Score 1 victory point if South Yemen is Soviet controlled, which it is. So 1 victory point to the US, so that drops the Soviet score to 5. Then remove Russian influence in the Middle East equal to the number of US controlled countries in the region. The US controls 1 country in the region, so they can remove 1 influence. So they will remove 1 from Egypt. And top of turn 5, back to the Soviets. Cannot hang on to anything. All right, gonna have to use CENTCOM, I think. All right, so we're gonna use the CENTCOM card. There's a CENTCOM token in here somewhere. There it is. We'll drop that in Madagascar. The Russian player may not make coup attempts or realignment rolls against that country. Just period for the rest of the game. So, yay for CENTCOM, I guess. But that does give the Russians 3 operational points. -1 because of the Albano-Stalinist economics, making it 2 points of influence. 1 point is going straight into Egypt to regain control. And the second point is going into Kenya. Is that worthwhile? It probably is. And that is the top of turn 5. Maybe reinforcing in Egypt would have been smarter, though. Well, no, I'll leave it as is. Bottom of US round 5. If you think that was silly and I should have boosted up Egypt, please leave a comment. Carter Doctrine. The U.S. may designate 1 roll this turn to be either a 1 or a 6 prior to rolling the die. Wow. I don't know that they need that, but they're definitely going to use. Well, man. Can't do the... Well, no, I don't want to risk a coup over there. Influence? All right, going to use all 4 points for realignment. It's painful. Do a realignment in Egypt. So that's +2 to the Soviets versus the US's +0. But it works. And then they will realign again in an effort to get rid of all of the influence in Egypt. Same situation. Does not work that time. But they got 2 more tries. Try it again. Nope. And finally, try it in Somalia with the last attempt. In this case, it's a +2 to the US and a +1 to the Soviets. 5 on 5, no effect. All right, well, there is to show you, I probably should have reinforced Egypt. Top of turn 6. Is now the time to do scoring? Probably not. Influence, man. There's almost nothing left that's going to be useful. The Soviets are going to have to use the mid-war 2-pointer. It scored 2 VPs, so that gives 2 more VPs to the US, but it gives them 2 operational points. -1 for influence, so they can once again bump up to 2 in Egypt and try to hold on to that. Because cooing almost anywhere is too dangerous right now. And bottom of 6. What horrors will the US have now? We are the world. If there are any countries with famine markers, nope. So the US just gets 1 operational point, which they will use for influence, except it's going to cost them double in those places because the Soviets have solid control there. They can't risk that either. Could they do an influence op? Maybe in Somalia? All right, a 1 point influence op in Somalia. That's +2 to the US, +1 to the Soviets. And it works. Excuse me, realignment. It's really influence ops, but they just didn't call it that back then. So the influence ops works, the realignment roll is successful, and just like that, the Soviet control is slipping away from the Horn of Africa. Top of round 7, almost the end of the game. Got to do the scoring now, I guess. Can't hold it. So, presence. 1 point. The Soviets do in fact have presence in the Horn of Africa, so they get 1 point. The US also has presence in the Horn of Africa. They also get 1 point. Well, the US controls no battleground countries, so they did not achieve domination. The Soviets control battleground and non-battleground countries, but they do not control more countries overall, so they don't get domination either, so there's no actual point change. Plus, the only difference is +1 controlled battleground country in a region, so the Soviets get +1 for controlling Egypt, and the US gets +1 for more influence in the sea lanes. So the scoring card accomplishes absolutely nothing. And on to the US. Anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Republic, so they get 2 influence points. They don't want to cause nuclear war. How do they get victory points out of this? Going up the space track. So for 2 operational points, they need to roll a 1 to 4. And they do. So they go up, which gives the US 2 victory points, which brings the Soviet total down to 1. And that leads to, wow, that's going to give you the US the game, I do believe. That leads to turn 8, due to the special card for the Soviets, who don't really have anything left that they can do, which brings us to the end of the game. Which means that at the very end of the game, the Autobot player gets 1 more point in the space track, which gives them 3 victory points. 1, 2, 3, which gives the US a victory by 2 points, thanks to the darn auto space track. So there you go. There's the first probably lots of mistakes in it games. The Soviets lost by 2 points. I hope you found this entertaining. I found it kind of confusing and sort of entertaining. Theoretically, the rules are straightforward, but in some cases, not so much.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching my episode of Twilight Struggle, playing the solo Soviet player and losing. I realized I should have scored the Horn of Africa and the Middle East again at the end of the game, but considering the scoring Africa would have changed nothing, having just scored it, and the Middle East would have just boosted the US score further as they were in more control than the Soviets, plus the 1 victory point that the US gets for hanging on to the 1 card they had from the start of the game, just would have made the US victory more complete, so I didn't see the point. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please stay tuned for I play the US solo version and see if the Soviets can manage to beat me again. Thanks for watching.